Hi, this is Chuck from Nerd3D. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to set up Poser to use motion blur in your renders. Now, there's a couple of places where we're going to need to change settings in order for motion blur to work. And of course, we're also going to need motion or an animation for there to be something to actually blur. For this tutorial, I've set up a little animation where Maisie's hitting a volleyball. The first place we need to change settings is on the actual camera that we're going to use for the renders. Each camera has its own separate settings for this, so if you use multiple cameras, you'll need to set up each one individually. The two settings that we're concerned with is shutter open and shutter close. The balance of these two controls how blurry or motion blurred the image is going to be. The second place we're going to need to change settings is on the actual render settings. Each of the render engines has its own separate settings for motion blur. You'll have to set the settings for the one you're going to use. On Superfly, you're going to need to enable motion blur. If you're using Firefly, you'll need to enable the 3D motion blur option. Now let's take a look at actually setting up the shutter speed, or how blurry the motion blur is going to be. The shutter opening is when the shutter opens in comparison to the beginning of a frame. The shutter close is when it closes on its way to the next frame. So at a value of 0.5, that means it's going to blur from this way halfway to the next frame. So it's going to be a little bit less blurred than just jumping from one frame to the next. The lower these numbers are on shutter close, the sharper the image is going to be, and the higher, the more blurry it's going to be. For the sake of sanity, we're not going to adjust both of them. We're just going to use the shutter close control. I'm going to set this to 1 so the blur goes all the way from the first frame to the second frame. Let's render that and see what it looks like. As you can see, a setting of 1 makes a pretty blurry or strong motion blur effect. If that's more blur than you want in your scene, you can turn down the amount of blur by turning down the value on the shutter closed. 0.5 will be half as blurry as a value of 1. If you want a very sharp but just a little bit of blur, a value of 0.1 would be more appropriate. Let's take a look at what that looks like. If you were rendering for a still image, the value of 0.1 would probably be a preferred setting because there would be just enough blur to imply the motion, and yet the figure wouldn't be too distorted to recognize what it actually is. This should help you get started using motion blur. Thanks for watching and have fun using Poser.